So we are not on stream yet. I can smoke without being accused.
Welcome, Manish. Good evening.
Yeah, hi, Purnasthira.
How are you doing?
Good. Hi to everyone.
Hi.
All well?
Hello.
Hello, Maru. How are you?
Fine. What about you?
Good. So here winter is.
Messy. Welcome, Manish. Good evening.
Yeah, hi, Purnasthira.
How are you doing?
Good. Hi to everyone.
Hi.
All well? What is that? That recording, is it?
No, it's actually the live streaming on YouTube. So it has a slight 3-second delay. And as I do it from my browser here, until I mute it, you're going to hear both.
Okay.
So we have Andrea Nicastro. So I think it's late in India, and I think it's Friday evening in Italy, which, and we're back from the pandemic. So I think I'll start, even though, and people will join as they join. So good evening, everybody, and welcome today. And thank you for making the time. We don't have Professor Panicha today with us because of some personal issues, but on the behalf of the School of Economic Competition of Venice and the Global Observatory for Local Communities, welcome to this webinar on the power dynamics in South Asia and its effects in Kashmir. Just on a side note, today is for all us Indians a very somber day because it is the anniversary of, in 1947, of the first Pakistani-backed attack on Kashmir. It's been a strange couple of days because I've had, during my preparation for this webinar, time to read up on history again. I mean, this is stuff I've been reading up on since I was 13, but I keep reading it again from different perspectives to see if I missed something. And the fall of Kabul on the 15th of August is strangely reminiscent of the same story that goes on again and again, with Pakistan's involvement, tribesmen attacking, and you never know what's right and what's not. And it's very sad because I've also been in touch quite often these days with the ambassador of Afghanistan to Rome, who's doing his best to keep the plight of his people under the public eye in Italy. And the whole of South Asia has now spiraled into this uncertainty that it was kind of almost rising out of a couple of years ago. And I think this is a very important day for us to think about it, to discuss it, and essentially talk about, from 1947 till the 15th of August 2021, what has happened, what has gone right, and what has all gone wrong. So I welcome today's panelists, and I'd like to start with Andrea Nicastro, who is an excellent journalist who has followed Afghanistan for the past 20 years. He's Corriere della Sera's traveling correspondent. I like the word traveling in his title because it means, he has the right to travel. So, Andrea, I'd like you to speak about Afghanistan, the region, and how that boils down, according to you, on your viewpoint, to Kashmir. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you very much for hosting me, and nice to see, and I will be pleased to listen to all the panelists. I think that what we have witnessed in August in Afghanistan is probably going to be recorded in history books as the most disturbing, incredible behavior of the world leader country in decades. United States signed an agreement in Doha in 29th of February 2020 to end the longest war. But the gesture, of course, was legitimate, but Washington failed to impose the most basic conditions for its withdrawal to a weak enemy. There are a lot of unknown facts about the Doha Pact, but what we can see in the daylight is that the world superpower basically surrendered to a bunch of guerrilla fighters armed with light weapons. Washington didn't think needed to protect its ally in Kabul, the Ghani government, nor its own soldiers, equipment, and collaborators, or allied under the ideological perspective, such as India. The result was a spectacular failure, an humiliating retreat, comparable only to Saigon the 70s, but worse than that. Having said that, does it mean that United States lost its war with the Taliban or lost Afghanistan as a political influence? Simply as it is, Washington wanted to leave, wanted to end its commitment in the country. Probably didn't want to lose so badly and didn't want a regime change, but that implied such a bad, we say in Italian, figure, such a brutta figura, very bad image worldwide. But the American wanted a regime change. The American decision to abandon 30 million Afghans to their former fanatic rulers and to betray who believed in the American project to export Western values and democracy in Asia, in a Muslim region, all of that has two main reasons, in my opinion. The first one is the historical swing from interventionism to isolationism in the States. Basically, an internal policy problem. From Bush Jr. to Obama to Trump to Biden, all American presidents were more or less promising to their constituency to end the Afghan adventure. Even the Obama military surge with 130,000 soldiers was aimed to end the war. But even if this is the most clear factor, it is not the most important one. The main reason, in my opinion, for the Afghan exit is a long-term strategic repositioning of the American power. At the beginning, Afghanistan was part of the American attempt to fill the void left by the Soviet collapse. They did the same in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe, even in Ukraine or the Baltic state. Washington tried to take the historical opportunity to reduce the Russian sphere of influence. In 2001, Washington was the only superpower standing. China was much weaker and humble than it is today, and Moscow was in pieces, sacked by a kleptocracy that didn't respect any of the Russian historical political goals. The condition for staying in Afghanistan were not there anymore. USA needed to focus on other threats, and Afghanistan is the perfect hot potato for Washington, two main enemies. Leaving Afghanistan in chaos under a fanatic Islamist terrorist faction set the stage for a slow wear to the two rivals, China and Russia. Both of them are exposed to Islamist infiltration. Both had to fight Islamist terrorism. China in Xinjiang and Russia in its Islamic southern belt, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, all the others, former Soviet state. China and Russia understood perfectly this strategy. They understood what was going on, and they tried to engage with the Taliban before the collapse of the Ghani government. In July, Beijing invited Taliban delegation, and Mullah Baradar declared what China wanted to hear, that Uyghurs are Chinese internal issue. The Taliban will not interfere. And Beijing replied the same way. China would not interfere in Afghanistan. In August, both China and Russia didn't close their embassies in Kabul. In September, they showed their cooperation with the Taliban, delivering humanitarian help and vetoing the Panjshiri resistance. Russia did that with not allowing the flight of 2 badly needed Panjshiri helicopters from Tajikistan. And that was a decisive move to end momentarily the Panjshiri military resistance. In October, they did disregard the Italian initiative for stabilizing Afghanistan and started just yesterday, I think, the Moscow format to help Kabul not to fall apart and start a wave of starving refugees or blackmail or terrorism. And how about US after leaving? To make more and more evident the shift of interest from Central Asia, Afghanistan, to Indo-Pacific region, Washington first pushed for 2.6 billion US dollars in arms sales to Philippines, without any regards for human rights abuse by the Manila government. Second, encourage Japan to study weapons of hypersonic technology and other long-range missiles. And third, added to Quad, the quadrilateral security dialogue among India, Japan, Australia, United States, the like-minded democratic states in Asia, added to the Quad a real security partnership among USA, Great Britain, and Australia, AUKUS, which excluded the Asian democracies, Japan and India. It is AUKUS which provoked the French reaction for the multi-billion Australian contract for Anglo-Saxon submarine instead of the French ones. Afghanistan, and I'm going to end, is back in the great game among world powers. In 19th centuries, it was the British Empire against the Tsarist Empire. Nowadays, it's the American Empire attempt to slow down the growth of Chinese power. Beijing will have to deal with an unstable Taliban emirate, prone to use terrorism and the leverage to obtain economic help, unable or unwilling to control terrorist group in its own territory. And Afghanistan is a sponge for any economic effort by Beijing to help the development of such huge and poor country. To summarize, America didn't lost with the Taliban, but on the contrary, choose them as a destabilizing agent against its more valuable enemies, China and Russia, and did that ignoring 30 years rhetoric of humanitarian interventions from Bosnia to Somalia, from Iraq to Kosovo, and 70-year image of a good, democratic and free superpower against all the world villain and all evil states. It's a huge change, and we will see the consequences in the year to come. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for your intervention. Next, I'd like to go to Mauro Bonavita, who is a research scholar at King's College London. Mauro, we'd really like to hear from you how this drills down to Kashmir, to Pakistan, to India and China in probably the most militarized zone in the world now after the two Koreas. So over to you, Mauro.
Thank you very much, Vas, and I thank the Venice School of Economic Competition and the Global Observatory for Local Communities for inviting me. So in 2011, when the US invaded Afghanistan, on the emotion of the 9/11 tragic events, and with a rational choice to go after Talibans who were supporting Osama bin Laden, one of the big questions of the international stage was the control of the Middle East. Back then, the People's Republic of China and India were still emerging economies, implementing structural reforms. In the case of India, we know very well the great importance of the work that during the 1990s, India has implemented in order to emerge as one of the largest economies today. 2001 is also the year when the chronic BRIC Brazil, Russia, India, and China was forged to identify these countries which were still emerging in the international context. Today, the situation is completely different. Today, we had a global shift power from West Asia to East and Southeast Asia due to the deterioration of the security situation in East and Southeast Asia as a direct effect of China's rise. China is perceived as a threat from many countries in the region and is indeed acting in some part of Asia and Southeast Asia as an assertive power. And this has reflects on world economy and world peace, because we are talking about a nuclear power which is challenging actually the hegemon. Now, parallel to this, we have a clear, evident perception of the US decline. We heard before from the previous panelists this idea that internal political crisis, which we saw emerging dramatically the 6th of December of this year with the attack on the US Capitol, but also the perceived term of Donald J. Trump as President of the United States contributed to the idea that as China emerges as a rising power and becomes more assertive, the United States seems not so capable to counterbalance it. Actually, we could talk a lot about this because, in fact, what we are witnessing is much more than a US decline. One of the most important historical pivots from the previous geopolitical and security regime, which ended with the Cold War, to a new one, which is set in Asia with its confront. This confront is based on the battleground between two great visions, which are taking place in Asia. One is the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, championed by China, and the other one is the Indo-Pacific concept. Of the two, the Indo-Pacific concept is the one which presents two great strengths. The first one is that the Indo-Pacific is a specific Asian concept. It is not something created from outside. As we all know, the Indo-Pacific is a term which was coined by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in 2007 when he visited India, talking to the Indian parliament in order to try to create an environment of cooperation in front of the Chinese rise. And from there, the concept of the Indo-Pacific is now spread throughout the world. We have the United States changing the name of their military command from Asia Pacific to the Indo-Pacific Command. We have the United States, the European Union, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Great Britain approving Indo-Pacific strategies. This is a vision, and the second strength of the Indo-Pacific is this: it's bringing together several countries. This is not the BRI, it's not a hierarchical vision of a world which is imposed on others who are either threat or bought with money, but it's something which is genuinely bringing together different countries. Now, the situation has also changed on the side of India, because nowadays, compared to 2001, India is one of the largest economies on earth. It's a country which is becoming more and more politically influent on the international stage. And due to its geographical centrality in the new Indo-Pacific region, is going to become essential for any coherent attempt to counterbalance the Chinese rise. Now, how do we bring Afghanistan and Kashmir in all of this vision? So, for India, the two major security threats are and remain Pakistan and China. Both Pakistan and China are nuclear powers. Both Pakistan and China share large and sometimes undefined, in the case of China and India, borders, talking about the Himalayan. And this is still at the heart of the Indian foreign policy. Because of course, as we all know very well, China is not simply threatening other countries in the South China Sea or in the Indo-Pacific, but is constantly violating all the kind of agreements on the Himalayas with perceived aggressive threat. So in the case of Afghanistan, for India, this is the closest periphery to its core security issues. Afghanistan is a big problem because it provides Pakistan, a historical antagonist of India, with geographical depth in its confrontation with India. We know very well that Pakistan is a very small country in terms of population and economy compared to India. And the fact that they are able to include, or at least to englobe part of Afghanistan in their sphere of influence, plays to their part. And then there's the issue with China. China's interest in having Afghanistan liberated by the US influence and also by India influence, because let's not forget that in the last 2 decades, India has played an important role in trying to support the democratic Afghani government in both with infrastructural and political support of Afghanis leadership. The fact that two essential enemies of China are out of the country, it's making for China an important and positive, from their point of view, of course, development. Now, we could say that Afghanistan demonstrates one of the most important limits when it comes to Indian foreign policy. India has supported the United States reaction to China, which is very, very important, but Afghanistan is a place where the interests of India and the United States are divergent. While in the Indian Ocean and in Southeast Asia, India and the United States are cooperating in order to counterbalance China, in the case of Afghanistan, they are not in line. For the United States, Afghanistan is something which is left behind for China and Pakistan to deal with the hope that it will bleed them as much as it did to them. For India, Pakistan is a potential source of problems because the Pakistani regime, and we know this very well, is not just supporting the Taliban, but is using some of the Taliban groups in its hybrid war with India in Kashmir. However, one of the big limits of Indian foreign policy is that it cannot be present in Afghanistan as it has to deal with China and Pakistan in its border. So it needs allies. And when the United States decided to leave Afghanistan, they remained with no allies to cooperate with in Afghanistan. We know that the Indian government is trying behind the doors to recreate a dialogue between the United States and Russia, which might be another important actor interested in counterbalancing terrorism emerging from Afghanistan. But this is very far away still from happening. So I would say that in general terms, right now, unfortunately, for India, is more to wait and see if the Pakistanis and the Chinese will make a wrong move rather than trying to attempt to make a positive one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mauro, and thank you for your observation on this new great game that has begun. I'd like to request Francesca Marino, veteran journalist, author, who has, as she told me once, been arrested in Pakistan as well as visited India often, to bring this towards the Indian subcontinent. Francesca.
Okay. Thank you to everybody. Just to put it straight, between on the topic of the webinar, reliable intelligence say that between 17th and 19th of August, Masood Azhar, the chief of the Jaish-e-Mohammed, was in Kandahar discussing with Baradani, between others, of the strategy to take. This was following an earlier meeting in Islamabad of Masood Azhar with ISI fellows who were telling them to keep quiet at least for the moment, and then to start again their jihad in Kashmir. Again, reliable sources from Pakistan-occupied Kashmir say that a number of jihadi freed by Taliban in Afghanistan were welcomed and paraded as heroes in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. The point is, each time we do analysis on Afghanistan, we forget Pakistan. There's always this big elephant in the room. We talk of Pakistan incidentally, forgetting that Pakistan created Taliban. Pakistan has been hosting Taliban in Quetta and in Karachi and in other places for years. Well, for all the duration of the so-called war on terror and the following Afghan government. I mean, Baradar was in Quetta, was in Karachi. Mullah Omar and his friends were in Quetta. Quetta has been bombed many times, except in where the Quetta Shura was, they took the chance to bomb Baluch. So the point is, Pakistan did this. They refused for 10 years to hand Baradar to US because they knew the moment would come. They needed Baradar, they needed the Quetta Shura, and this is what happened. I mean, in Qatar, Khalilzad, who, by the way, should be jailed and charged with treason for what he did and what he signed. Khalilzad did not make an agreement with Taliban. He made an agreement with Pakistan. Pakistan, as many Afghans would say, invaded Afghanistan peacefully. The Taliban did the dirty job. Pakistan is controlling Taliban. The government was formed under the supervision of the ISI chief. Pakistan was celebrating when Taliban took Kabul. An old video of the late General Gul was circulating where he was saying something he told me also many times. Pakistan will win America with the help of America. This is what they did. This is what they did. Now they have China behind. China strangled Pakistan with debts, but they don't realize it yet because most of the money and the land of the Belt and Road is going into the pockets of generals. Just look at the companies building Gwadar. So the point is, India, yes, is facing a difficult moment. The West is totally, I mean, even the G20 now, what they concluded, they had to do a G20 to resolve again to give money to Pakistan, to help the refugee they themselves created. Breaking news, Pakistanis don't give a damn for Afghan refugees. The only people freely crossing the border are Taliban. For the past 2 years, Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Toiba members have been settling training camps in Afghanistan, along with the Taliban. Taliban last year have been allowed, during the last year and a half, have been allowed again into KP, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where they set camps along with the army. Again, Pashtun activists will tell you all the story. There is but we are still giving money to Pakistan, and we are still considering Pakistan with the West. I mean, we are still considering Pakistan a key ally into this, without realizing even ISIS-K is a creation of Pakistan. Afghan intelligence, the former government, has been saying it for years. But of course, is easier to believe and this narrative was started many years ago by the American government with the connivance of Pakistan, is still easier to believe into good terrorists and bad terrorists. There are not good terrorists. They made them play one against the other. And yes, in Kashmir, in the past 2 months, again, we have seen infiltrations. Again, these guys are raising the head. I was in Geneva for a conference and a demonstration with POK citizens, Sindhi, Baluch, and Pashtun against the Pakistani government, and another demonstration organized and headed by somebody from the Pakistani embassy came holding Gilani pictures. I would like to remember that I was sitting with Mr. Gilani during the stone pelting when 2 young guys came to report about the spontaneous demonstrations of the previous night. So until we don't face the real problem of the area, which is Pakistan, will not go anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca. And thank you for that, sharing that candid incident where you were personally involved in Geneva. Manish, today is the 74th anniversary of Operation Gulmarg. We are back to square one. The way I see it, it's the same pattern that started in 47, where a bunch of tribesmen, same thing that happened in Bangladesh, the attempt at imposing a cultural and physical genocide of people. And now we're back again with the Taliban regime in Kabul, which Pakistan's trying to portray itself as a victim of circumstance, as well as a supporter of human rights. From the Indian perspective, you can bring this in specifically in light of all the attacks on the minorities increasing in Kashmir, the drug trade that's just spiked up with 3,000 kilos of cocaine. Oh no, I'm sorry, it was heroin that was caught on the Mundra port. So over to you, Manish Chand.
Thanks, Vas, for inviting me to this very important and timely conversation. You know, this is, as you pointed out, this is indeed a very somber occasion. Those who have long memories or, read enough on this would recall with horror, what happened on October 22, 1947. This was a day when 6,000 to 7,000 raiders, sponsored by the Pakistani army establishment, plundered the Kashmir, raped women, went on literally a killing spree. And that template, and they were backed, of course, and there were a lot of Pakistani army guys were embedded in with these raiders. Now, this whole modus operandi, using, now you can substitute freelance raiders with, the terrorist groups we have, proxies like Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed and all. And this was a kind of a template that was mastered around that time. It has been repeated again in 1965, 1989, Bangladesh and everywhere. So now essentially it's the same playbook, which is being replayed again and again. Now, first, I also like to thank, previous speakers, especially Francesca Marino, for highlighting the fountainhead of all these problems, where it's coming from, which is Pakistan. I'll come to that later when I speak about other things, but coming to the more immediate and urgent issue, which is dominating the headlines in Indian newspapers and elsewhere as well, is the systematic target of minorities, in Kashmir. If you look at the Sikhs and the targeting of Sikhs and Hindus, And these are the people who have, who are actually completely harmless. They have nothing to do with politics. These are the people from outside the state. And some of them are, like, for example, the Kashmiri Hindu who was killed, the good chemist, he was known to help out people, day and night. You could call him in midnight, he'll send medicines and all that. So, this is actually a barbaric, very savage attempt to polarize Kashmiri society, which was settling into some kind of peace. Regardless of, that's a separate subject, the merits and what happened in the, abolition of Article 370 and all that. But right now, the violence and, there is a pattern there. It could not be happening. It is not a spontaneous violence. It is orchestrated, it is manipulated, and it is sponsored by, the same usual villains, usual operatives across the border. There is a clear imprint here. They have created a front here called, the Resistance Front, which is sponsored by Pakistan's military establishment, and they have been at it, these killings. Now, the point is this, that these killings are happening barely 2 months after the Taliban takeover. And we know the pattern, if you go chronologically, that the days after, the Taliban takeover, Al-Qaeda celebrated, rejoiced in the victory, and said it's time to liberate other Muslim lands, including Somalia, including Kashmir. As pointed out by one of the previous speakers, it's a more complicated story. The Taliban, of course, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Pakistani proxies, they trained with the Taliban, they supported, and there was this incestuous linkage with them. But the Taliban does not have exactly a pan-Islamic ideology like Al-Qaeda. They're more Pashtun. This is an important distinction to be made, because on their own, because right now, Taliban is really desperate to get legitimacy. The Taliban dispensation is totally cash-strapped. They don't have money to pay people's salaries. There's not enough food. You have an unfolding humanitarian catastrophe there. And this government is not recognized by anyone, not even Pakistan, China. Officially, nobody, not a single country has recognized the regime. Now, the point when we talk about the connection between developments in Afghanistan and Kashmir, there is a clear linkage. This was what India feared the most, and it has come true. Its worst nightmare has come true. So, Taliban takeover from the Indian perspective has been a major setback to India's core strategic interest in the region, in Afghanistan. And this is especially such a big blow because India really nurtured the other side of it, the Afghanistan it tried to position the Afghanistan as a hub of economic opportunity. It pumped in around $3 billion US dollars, more than that, for an array of development economic projects. Each province of Afghanistan has an India-aided and India-backed development project. And this is beside the thousands of grassroots projects, And the thing about these projects, they have transformed lives of people. They have made a difference to the lives of people. So from Indian perspective, the goodwill they cumulatively generated over the last 2 years and all the good work now is in danger of being of unraveling with a hostile regime, which for the sake of recognition is kind of quoting India. If you look at the initial statements from the Taliban spokesperson and all, when Indian embassy, they completely packed up, and our ambassador also left Kabul, they said you should not have left, should have stayed on. So they are now coming to India to seek recognition from India. Also, I want to point out in this debate that, we should not be looking at the Taliban as a monolithic monster. By that, I mean that, of course, the tendency is, and rightly so in some ways, Taliban is Pakistan's creation, is beholden to Pakistan establishment. But at the same time, there are factions within Taliban, or groups, which will like to carve an independent path. away from Pakistan, and they would look at India as a balancer of sorts. And as you know, in the early, some people were sidelined because Pakistani guy, ISI chief, was in Kabul just ahead of government formation to manipulate it, to completely control the government and the establishment, much to the detriment of India. So it's an ongoing, and now you could see the visible manifestation in form of killings and violence, which are becoming a daily affair of sorts. And these are really innocent people. And these killings come at a time when, Kashmir was witnessing a record surge of tourists. So it was kind of coming to terms with the new realities on the ground. And so now coming to the point about Pakistan, because Pakistan is a middle. And thanks to Francisca again for pointing out so vividly that Pakistan duplicity has to be, it's time to really call a spade a spade. I don't know. I mean, this is the biggest scandal in the history that for 2 decades, the world's superpower, United States of America, could get taken for a ride by these people in Pakistan military establishment. I can't imagine, where is that? Unless there are people in American establishment who are benefiting from this publicity. So this is the point is billions of dollars were channelized, were diverted to fund the Taliban, terrorist proxies. It was a massive hoodwinking of the entire international community, which was providing this funding. So, in a different context, as former US Secretary of State called Pakistan a permanent migraine. So it is a migraine. It is a fountainhead, and it is time for the world to come to really grips with it, as in what is to be done. Because even now one can see the tendency that the US may fall back again into the trap, that this whole construct of seeing Pakistan as an ally in the global war against terror, I think this was the biggest delusion, which has cost the region, the world, and people of Afghanistan. It's been a huge loss. So how do we call Pakistan to account? Now, international community has a major role to play, and it's already doing so. Of course, now this webinar, we have Italian, intellectual journalists participating in it, and Rome is going to be hosting the G20 summit. I will also be coming to see that up, and there was an extraordinary meeting of the G20 on Afghanistan recently. So by and large, there is an emerging international consensus. It cannot be business as usual with the Taliban. And there are 3 conditions which they've already laid down. And one is that Afghan territory should not be used as a staging ground for terror attacks, respect for minorities, women, and inclusive government. On all these criteria, and there is a sense of irony here, because this is what India and other sensible countries have been saying, that we were talking about these red lines when Taliban reconciliation, so-called Taliban reconciliation, was in incipient stages. And now we are facing the same situation. So the point, I think the greatest fallacy was, in some sense, the good and the bad Taliban. It was a very distorting, as our former foreign minister said famously, just one thing: moderate Taliban is an oxymoron. So, Taliban is a Taliban, a terrorist is a terrorist. To segment into some kind of thing to provide ideological justification, and this kind of duplicity has cost all of us dear. So the international consensus is clear, and we have to really, the international community has to mobilize that pressure to compel Pakistan to stop the employment of terrorism as an instrument of state policy. I think this is the core issue. How to do it, how to get there is easier said, but I think on this, there should be absolutely no confusion, no ambiguity. I think I would end here, take the debate forward. Maybe there are some questions.
Before I ask for any questions, I'd like to make a small observation. I've been following this new quad that has developed in the recent days with the visit of Foreign Minister Jaishankar to Israel. This new grouping of the US, India, Israel, and the UAE, bringing the first Islamic country into this fold of the Quad business. And I think that that's very important given the current situation, because I'd like to go back to something that Mauro said about the Indo-Pacific, and Mauro is one of the leading European experts in the Indo-Pacific, that I found it very strange that the US sacrificed land-based supremacy by sacrificing Afghanistan to take over sea supremacy, even though it was quite obvious that the Indo-Pacific accounts for 80% of the world's trade and 60% of the world's energy transport. But I think this sacrifice of Afghanistan in order to preserve a supremacy over the seas, which again is doubtful because the Chinese Navy is now bigger than the American Navy and is growing at a pace far that outweighs the Indian and the US Navy. So Mauro, going back to you, I'd just like to ask you this question. Do you really think it was worth it?
Well, it's a very good question. Thank you. So I would say this. The Americans has always been moved by a very clear strategic view, which is the one of the inland. So they believe that following theories which were established in the last century, they believe that by controlling the sea states, the coastal states, they can overcome any land power coming from Central Asia. Now, this is a big discussion about this, but in general terms, we can say that what you refer to as the new Quad involving the UAE and Israel is all part of the same strategy, which starts from Western Europe, goes to the Balkans, the Greek-Turkish conflict and how America is playing there, goes through the Middle East and ends up in East Asia. So from the American side, the answer is absolutely yes, it makes sense for them. Because as you said, the energy is moving through on the Indo-Pacific. The containers are moving on the Indo-Pacific. Supply chains, world supply chains are aligned on the Indo-Pacific sea route. So right now, the interest is absolutely there. If I can add something on what Manish said, if you give me just 1 minute, Vas, thank you. So I would say that it's true that India has invested a lot in supporting democratic Afghanistan, and this was very, very important. And how can the world call Pakistan to account? It's very difficult to call to account a nuclear power. It's very, very difficult. This is one of the big problems. We can discuss why was Pakistan allowed to become nuclear power, big discussion. But right now, we are here where we are. So Pakistan and Myanmar, you'll see both dictatorship, both places where the military is exercising an important role, both countries which are in the middle in the struggle between China and the United States. Because we talk a lot about Pakistan, rightly so, but we have to remember that now China is becoming the protector of Pakistan, pushing money into it and taking under control the country. So as long as the rivalry between China and the United States will exist, these two pivotal countries, Pakistan and Myanmar, will always be courted from time to time by one part or the other. And on the other side, again, coming back to the idea of the nuclear power, the big problem of Pakistan is that its security is failing. We know very well that the military are keeping the country together, but we are very much concerned, for example, on how much the Islamist movement is infiltrating the country in the last decades. This is another big question, and how much the Pakistani infrastructure is capable of protecting itself from cybersecurity attacks, which are going to be more and more in the future. So I think it's very difficult to see the international community isolating Pakistan, rather than there will always be an interest in trying to engage with them. Then I agree with other panelists about what some European ministers did when they traveled to Pakistan, begging basically for them to solve the problem of refugees and migrants after the fall of Kabul was totally useless. Pakistan has no common interest with the European Union to solve this issue, but some form of engagement, either we like it or not, will always remain there. Thank you.
An open question to you all. Maybe it's an unfair question, but I'll put it down the table. The chance of another military coup in Pakistan, given the current situation, given the strategy of tension that has started, given the fear that the Taliban might reverse, the Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban might reversed its game on Pakistan. I mean, what do you think of a serious possibility in the next near 12 to 24 months of another military coup in Pakistan?
May I?
Francesca, please.
Well, believe it or not, Pakistan is already under a military regime.
I'm sorry, Francesca, I just want to interrupt you by saying Imran Khan in front with the army back is not my version of military regime. I'm talking about a real...
Well, Imran Khan is a puppet. Each time he opens his mouth, without somebody writing the script, we all know, starting from Japan and Germany sharing a border, ending to Haqqani being an Afghani tribe. Of course, forgetting when he was chief minister of KP, he founded Haqqania with lots of money for 2 years, and he baked the Haqqania din to the Senate. So, but see, many years ago, again, going back to late General Gul, he was talking of something which actually happened. First of all, General Gul was the one who turned Imran from being a playboy into an Islamic integralist. And then, you know, the discussions were back then, we don't need anymore a military coup because it is highly unpalatable for the West and for our precious allies, meaning they are not going to give us any more money or weapons or whatever. So better to have a hybrid regime, which is, of course, run by military. Nothing moves in Pakistan without army chief and ISI chief. So they will never do another open coup. They are not fools. Why should they? They are already ruling the country with all the benefits of a fake democracy, which we are very happy to call democracy and to endorse. So no chances.
It's a good argument.
Anybody would like to add something to all of this? Andrea Nicastro wrote a wonderful article about the transformation of Imran Khan from a playboy to a beardless Taliban was the heading, I think, Andrea. I sent it to Manish as well and a couple of other friends. Would you like to say something in this issue?
I think your question implied a very subtle provocation. Francesca is totally right, of course. The hybrid regime is in place and is there to stay, but we don't know whether the Islamist groups will be a real challenge or not for the military establishment. They are playing with extremism and with fanatism since 1970s, and sooner or later the mechanism can break down, and they might be overcome by it even more fanatic than they are. The problem of having this hybrid government with military figure at the head and even a staged democracy in place is a problem for someone who has a different agenda and want to show a pure Islamic value. And they are growing stronger and stronger. And with the Taliban help, the groups inside Pakistan might try to impose their own agenda on the actual government. We have witnessed already a wave of terrorist attack against the Islamabad ministers and public figures in the past, and they had to come down to pact when they forbid the American to bomb and use the drone campaign on the border lands and border territories. So it's we should not think that they control everything, because people have a unique and personal identity and will. Of course, the military structure is strong, can rely on a good and powerful means, but the growing of militants and an ideology that might go against the overall geostrategical policy of the actual Pakistan government is still in place, in my opinion.
May I add something?
Please.
The Islamization of the country is already there. From the last thing was changing launching this new program for schools. The textbooks have been widely criticized. The cover of them shows dad and son wearing Western clothes, sitting on a sofa, mother and daughter in traditional clothes, head covered, sitting on the floor. Imran said many times from his arguing, commenting one of the many cases of rapings happening in the past few months in Pakistan, commenting one of them, he was blaming, as usual, Western culture, Western clothes, everything which is Western. More, what it is worst, when the Charlie Hebdo trial started, he was at the head and giving free hand, formally banning, then giving free hand and support to all of those asking for the beheading or the expulsion of the French ambassador. You might have noticed he is proposing himself as the champion of Islam. And this is not by chance. I'll tell you something. I think I never said on record. Let's say a bit more than 10 years ago, was circulating a document in Pakistan in a very small circle. The document was not signed, but clearly Army and ISI made, where this document was theorizing the building of a regime, a hybrid mixed with army and civilians, an Islamic regime made like this. That's why I was saying that they don't need a coup. Everything was in that document. And it was, you know, it had to be made in stages. And at the point, it was saying, even if we had to suspend for a while the so-called civil rights, they would say so-called so-called civil rights does not matter. So that is the situation. Actually, this process is already going on. It's already going on, and you will see in the future, it will get worse and worse.
Right. If I may make a point, in response to what Mauro said, about how can you isolate or call to account a nuclear weapon country. I think we really need to give serious thought. And there is, in fact, I personally think that it's time to call off also, call the bluff of the Pakistan nuclear blackmail, as it were, there is a lot, in fact, international community can do. First, the myth of Pakistan's nuclear blackmail. I think there's a lot of bravado here. For example, India has fought wars with Pakistan, and a nuclear weapon Pakistan, 1999, say Kargil, when we did that, it was a nuclear weapon power and all that. But the point is that the nuclear weapons are the last resort. It is only when rulers are will be gripped by some sort of suicidal madness, then in the times we live in, that nuclear weapon option will be used. So there is a nuclear deterrence in place. Pakistan also knows that if they were to use nuclear weapons against India, we can destroy them anytime. So it's really no-win situation. So if you keep aside the nuclear weapons and then look at how to isolate Pakistan, it can actually work. And and this is already some major financial pressure is being applied. Pakistan is a sad place. It's financially, it's torturing the regime, and it's a really a hollowed out sort of team in some ways, which is just exploiting propaganda and slogans to obtain power, and also the Islamic radicalism. As far as the people of Pakistan, and they talk about also very briefly about democracy. And I agree with the two speakers, this hybrid regime is perfectly suits Pakistani establishment. But as long as this hybrid regime and the military dispensation is in power in Pakistan, one cannot expect any radical change in Pakistan behavior. So, the FATF route, which is being now used, Financial Action Task Force, we have to look at how to financially squeeze Pakistan. Also, the second thing which can be done more effectively is by speaking in one voice. I think the international, so far, last 2 decades especially, Pakistan has thrived despite giving shelter to the Taliban and all that, because American money was coming. Money from the West was coming. So if you really squeeze Pakistan financially, they will be compelled to see reason. And then the world has to speak in one voice. It is not that, it is only India's burden or some other country. The entire world has to get together and really, sanction. I mean, there's a lot of, there is an obsession about sanctioning Iran, which on account of nuclear weapons. What about sanctioning a country, a regime which brazenly uses nuclear weapons as a blackmail, as a form of blackmail, uses terror as an instrument of state policy, kills its own people? Look at the Balochistan. The kind of slaughter, the kind of atrocities visited on them. Look at what they have made of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. They're saying that they want Indian Kashmir. They can't handle their own Kashmir. They can't handle their own Balochistan. I mean, look at any idiot will want to live in Pakistani Kashmir. Let me tell you honestly, it's not because I'm an Indian. So the point is also, it has to become, also when we talk about these things, diplomacy has to become people-centric. When we talk, it looks like regime to regime talk. It looks like everything is a global geopolitical chessboard. But look at it from the point of view of Pakistani people who are suffering because of the rise in Islamic radicalism. The terrorism is devouring its own children, in a manner of speaking. So I think these fundamentals, there is a lot. We cannot afford to become, to be trapped in defeatism. We cannot become defeatist, and say that, oh, it's got nuclear weapons. And then the last thought, which I leave you with, what if Taliban regime acquires nuclear weapons? And I went in Pakistan. It looks like very far-fetched now, but if North Korea can acquire, then so can Taliban regime. And that will be the real nightmare for the world. That's all I have to say. Was, are you there?
Seem to be having internet problems for whatever strange reason, so I'm just hoping it's not a topic today. If that's, I'm sorry, I missed the last part. It was, if you could just, was there a question, Manish?
No, essentially, I hope the others were listening in on what I was saying.
I think Nana wants to say something. So,
No, basically, I was telling was, since you're not there, they were saying that, Moro spoke about, Pakistan having the nuclear weapon. And, the world can only prosecute or call to account Pakistan in a limited manner because it is a nuclear weapon power. And I'm saying that's not the way to look at it. It cannot go on with this nuclear blackmail for long. And there's a lot which the world community can do, especially by financially squeezing out. And one last thought which I was that, we are talking about Pakistan's nuclear blackmail. What about these mad mullahs' nuclear bomb? Taliban getting hold of nuclear bomb or developing in connivance with Pakistan and North Korea. If North Korea's Kim, the madman, can get nuclear weapons, so can Taliban mullahs, So this is a very scary thought, And it may seem very distant now, but there is a possibility. And who will pay for that,
Mauro, you wanted to say something? You had raised your hand?
Yes, no, just very briefly at what Manish said. No, of course, you're totally right. Pakistani people are suffering because of this situation. And many of the things you say make perfectly sense. Simply, my role, it's not to support one side or the other, simply to put some consideration which are unfortunately there. So one is the nuclear power one, and I agree with you, it is unfortunately blackmail on the Pakistani side, but still it's there. The other one is the geographical one, which enters in the geopolitical confrontation between the US and China, because as you say very clearly, the Western and the democratic Asian societies should come together in order to try to prevent this situation. But if there is a rivalry going on and Pakistan is the territory between the two great powers, I fear it will be very difficult to see in the future, how should I say, a unique, let's say, point of view on this, unfortunately. But yes, you're right. The big problem with Pakistan for me is that it's basically a failed state in the sense that we define in international relations. So it's a state which is incapable of exercising its authority in many ways. It's kept together by the army, and this is the big problem. I don't think the Pakistani army will ever give a nuclear weapon to the Taliban. But what if the regime collapses? Now, other panelists expressed the idea that this is unlikely to happen because of the internal domestic counterbalance of some security threats. But again, we know very well that China is very much concerned, for example, of its infrastructure and its people on the Pakistani territory, and they request more security. And this is going to play a part in the future of Pakistan if Islamist and local groups will exercise pressure on Chinese presence in Pakistan. So everything is absolutely right. The domestic issue, the ethical problem with Pakistani people suffering, and all the problem regarding the immediate India-Pakistan relations. But there are unfortunately many more variables which are acting here on a more global stage. Thank you.
Sorry, China is not concerned with Islamist groups in Pakistan. China is concerned with Baluch. China is concerned, which are not an Islamist group. Baluch are just fighting because they've been deprived of all their rights. They've been taken the land without compensation, and Pakistan is killing them since 1948. There are mass graves, enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings. China is concerned with Baluch, China is concerned with Pashtun, China is not concerned with Islamic groups for the simple reason Islamic groups are controlled by ISI, and they already made an agreement. Uyghur houses are monitored and checked in Islamabad, and now also in Kabul. Uyghur women in Gilgit-Baltistan have been arrested. Uyghur women married to citizens of Gilgit-Baltistan have been arrested and disappeared. So China is very much at ease with Islamic groups. They just don't want Baluch.
I would second that, because I think this first international trip the Taliban delegation did was to China, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
But that said, look, Pakistan may have everything figured out. Thought they had everything figured out in '72 as well, and they lost East Pakistan. The fear of Pakistan balkanizing, the fear of extremist groups accidentally getting their hands on a nuclear weapon or nuclear material, I think these remain concerns of the West. Most importantly, the increase, I mean, on the 15th of August, India's 74th independence anniversary, when Kabul fell, the first thing that came to my mind was, of course, this is going to increase violence in Kashmir and in India, but after that, it's going to spread to every place where there is an Islamic hotspot, because every Islamic group is going to believe that the Taliban was successful in defeating the West. So I think India has, I mean, the increase in violence in Kashmir in less than 2 months already shows the effects it's having on South Asia. And I think sooner or later, Europe is also going to start seeing its repercussions. And they're always unfortunate, because they always end up in the loss of, life of common and innocent people. I think Pakistan needs to be brought to the book in some way, which does not involve total collapse of Pakistani society, because that would also mean handing over to these extremists a nuclear power, as Mauro aptly said. So I think it's a lot of tightrope balancing. I think G20 is going to be, Manish is going to be our guest in Rome shortly for the G20. So I think G20 is going to be a very nice opportunity to see, just after this extraordinary G20 on Afghanistan that Prime Minister Draghi did, what the global powers are going to have to say to the Indian Prime Minister, who's expected to be here in person, on the security situation in South Asia, because NATO, Europe, and the US have withdrawn, and they've left us Indians to foot the bill. So that said, if there are no other points, I'd like to thank you all for making time on Friday evening. I'd like to take a moment to remember 22nd October 1947 and the aftermath of Operation Gulmarg, which seems to have started a nightmare that never seems to want to finish. So, hoping for peace in a region that will probably not see peace for the next few decades to come. I wish you all a very good weekend, and thank you again for making the time. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Ash.